Hello from Heirloom Books at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois. I'm Jeff Helgeson. Perhaps the most influential poet of the 20th century, as well as a highly significant literary critic, editor, and playwright, not to mention Lloyd's of London banker, International Literary Magazine founder, and the light verse inspiration for Andrew Lloyd Webber's blockbuster Broadway musical Cats, was born into a staunchly Unitarian family in St. Louis, Missouri during September of 1888. A descendant of one of the judges who had served with an ancestor of Nathaniel Hawthorne at the Salem witch trials, and who has been described as a somewhat timid, even insecure, graduate from Harvard University who lived most of his adult life in England. This, of course, was Thomas Stearns, T.S. Eliot. Highly emotionally reserved in character, as a young man, Eliot became interested in such French symbolist poets as Charles Baudelaire and went to live for a year in Paris, developing a deep, and it's been suggested, intimate friendship with a Frenchman named Jean Verdinal, an observation that caused the poet to threaten a libel suit against the literary critic who'd suggested the prospect of a homosexual relationship. After returning from France during his final year as an undergraduate at Harvard, Eliot became interested in Sanskrit and Eastern religion, Buddhism in particular. Then, in 1914, he applied for a fellowship to England at Oxford University and studied philosophy with Bertrand Russell. In 1915, having the support of fellow American expatriate poet Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, who Pound nicknamed Possum, and observed had actually trained himself and modernized himself on his own, stunned the literary world with the opening lines of a poem published with Pound's help in Harriet Monroe's Chicago-based poetry magazine, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, something which, according to an extensive article in the Chicago Tribune, set Eliot on the path to the Nobel Prize in 1948. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky like a patient etherized upon a table. From that beginning simile, Eliot's poem goes on to explore the sordid streets and alleyways and drawing rooms of London in the years following the development of modernist works ranging from Pablo Picasso's Cubism to Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, that composer eventually becoming a close personal friend of the writer, and providing a poetic voice that fulfilled Ezra Pound's mandate to make it new in no uncertain terms. The poem continues, let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent to lead you to an overwhelming question. Do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. And so we do, ending with the inaccessible vision of a one-time classical poetic world that the insecurities of our 20th century narrator will only allow him to perceive from a distance, stating, I've heard the mermaids singing each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea by sea girls wreathed with seaweed red and brown, till human voices wake us and we drown. When first published with a collection of other poems in book form in 1917, Eliot dedicated the love song to J. Alfred Prufrock to his French friend, Eugene Verdinal, who died in 1915 during the First World War, with its whole-scale fragmentation of European civilization. Then, with the first edition of his own literary magazine, Criterion, it was a vision of that war's aftermath which emerged in what is very probably Eliot's most influential poem, The Wasteland. Between the publication of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock in 1915 and The Wasteland at the end of 1922, same year as James Joyce's Ulysses, not only had the war to end all wars unfolded and come to its troubled conclusion, but there had additionally been Eliot's oceanic separation from a young, aspiring actress named Emily Hale, with whom, according to Peter Ackroyd in T.S. Eliot, A Life, the poet had engaged in an elaborate and innocent courtship, but then, much to her surprise, undertaken a somewhat hasty marriage to a woman in England named Vivian Hay Wood, with neither the bride nor the groom informing their respective families, and about which, again according to Ackroyd, brave New World author Aldous Huxley observed the relationship had been almost entirely a sexual nexus. This, fairly clearly as it was to turn out, had been a union for Eliot undertaken in haste and regretted at leisure, especially after the newlyweds shared living accommodations with Bertram Russell and Vivian engaged in a sexual nexus with her husband's former philosophy instructor, as somewhat obliquely suggested in the 1994 motion picture Tom and Viv, featuring William Dafoe and Miranda Richardson. Vivian, it was to turn out, like novelist Virginia Woolf, who she once had attacked with a toy rubber knife, apparently suffered from mental illness and eventually becoming separated from Eliot following 18 years of highly destructive marriage, from which the poet once observed she'd gained nothing, and he had obtained the state of mind needed to write The Wasteland. She was committed to an asylum, where she died suddenly of a heart attack in 1947. During the course of their marriage, following disclosure of the affair with Professor Russell, Eliot himself had also experienced a nervous breakdown, as Peter Ackroyd observed it had stated on the staff card at Lloyd's Bank. Subsequently, receiving a course of pre-Freudian psychological therapy in Lucerne, Switzerland, that stressed bringing a patient's awareness outside of subjective preoccupations, and during which, Eliot told Virginia Woolf, he had written the final sections of The Wasteland, having the text then reviewed by his wife, who'd commented, "Wonderful," regarding a section in which a highly distressed woman tries to get her emotionally withdrawn and unavailable husband to speak to her. The poem then being extensively edited by Ezra Pound before its final publication, with that spousal-approved passage even being referenced by the rock band Pink Floyd on its 1994 Division Bell album. Originally, The Wasteland had been called He Do the Police in Different Voices, referring to a line from Charles Dickens about a young boy who read newspapers out loud for their crime coverage, And the poem had begun with a long section of 54 lines describing college boys on a night out in Boston before the war. But Pound cut this entirely, beginning instead with the highly memorable line, "April is the cruelest month," carrying connotations of the pilgrimage from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales with its opening line, "In April the sweet showers fall," but letting Eliot continue, "breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." In its final form, Eliot dedicated The Wasteland to Ezra Pound, terming him the better craftsman in Italian, with a reference to another pilgrimage derived from the 26th canto of Dante's Purgatorio within the Divine Comedy, both the Renaissance poet and Eliot having been 35 years old at the time of the publication of their respective works, a midpoint within the biblically allotted human lifespan of 70. The Wasteland, ultimately depicting a pilgrimage towards Eastern enlightenment, your shadow at morning striding behind you, your shadow at evening rising to meet you, in keeping with ideas expressed in 1917 in an essay Eliot had titled Tradition and the Individual Talent, is filled with allusions that range across well over 3,000 years of Western culture, including within this heap of broken images and fragments shored against the runes, in addition to Chaucer and Dante, references to Homer and Sophocles with the blind transgender poet Tiresias, the Confessions of St. Augustine, William Shakespeare's song from his farewell to theater play, The Tempest, "Full fathom 5 thy father lies," as well as Antony and Cleopatra, Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphosis, Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, John Milton's Paradise Lost, books of the Bible, a reference to a fortune teller who'd appeared in Aldous Huxley's first novel, Chrome Yellow, and a beginning pre-war narrative appropriated from the memoir of an exiled Austrian countess who Eliot once had met, concerning her recollections of sledding downhill in the mountains, where you feel free, with her cousin, the Archduke, not Ferdinand, whose assassination in June of 1914 began the series of events that led to World War I, but rather to his uncle, Crown Prince Rudolph, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Sissy, Empress Elizabeth, who died as a result of an extramarital affair murder-suicide in 1889, 9 years before his mother was assassinated by a homemade knife-wielding anarchist who then asked to be beheaded when he was apprehended, and 15 years before the shot that would begin the First World War. All of these fragments, it seems, served to depict the ruins of Western civilization as they lay scattered throughout the poem, finally leading to a progressive spiritual journey across the archetypal elements of earth, wind, water, and fire, past the fallen towers of London, Vienna, Athens, and Alexandria, to finally ascend the barren slopes of Tibet, where the prayer wheels are perpetually turned, their words of elegy and requiem being scattered to the wind in an eternal hope for Shanti, Shanti, the Sanskrit term for peace. Now, however, if the wasteland seemed bleak, the Heirloom, which followed it, went even further, starting off, "We are the Heirloom, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, Alas, our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless as the wind in dry grass or rats' feet over the broken glass in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyze force. Those who have crossed with direct eyes into death's other kingdom, remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men, the stuffed men. And then, concluding, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. It was from this point of post-World War I despair, with perhaps no further into the abyss for Eliot to go, rather than seeking social order through fascism, as did Ezra Pound and Eliot's wife Vivian for that matter, the new direction the poet took was to declare himself classicist in literature, royalist in politics, and Anglo-Catholic in religion. At around the same time, in 1927, that a reconnection after 13 years was established with Emily Hale, who Lloyd Gordon, or Lindell Gordon, in a book titled Eliot's New Life, replaced Vivian as Eliot's muse, becoming, like Beatrice for the Renaissance poet Dante, the means by which the modernist writer passed over into love of God in his own Via Nova, or New Life. Essentially, T.S. Eliot abandoned nihilism with, like in his marriage 13 years before, a secret baptism and confirmation into the Church of England, taking a vow of celibacy, once more much to Emily Hale's surprise, and lecturing about the danger to society of secularism just at the time when Bertrand Russell had published an article called Why I Am Not a Christian. Eliot also began first writing a religious poem titled The Rock, and later a stage play concerning the martyrdom of Sir Thomas à Becket called Murder in the Cathedral. Eliot's conversion additionally coincided with his separation from Vivian, initially moving in with a bishop of the Church of England before coming to share accommodations with a man named John Chamberlain, who was wheelchair-bound and suffered from muscular dystrophy. And it was Eliot's new faith that then became a dominant influence upon both his writing and his personal life. Eliot's poetry and his plays and his literary criticism each became directed toward the advocacy of a Christian worldview, and with the beginning section of his partially World War II composed 4 quartets, while serving as an air raid warden before moving away from London during the Blitz. It is the memory of returning to a familiar place with Emily Hale that inspired the lines, "Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past." Continuing, "What might have been and what has been point to one end, which is always present. Footfalls echo in the memory down a passage we did not take, towards a door we never opened." Although on one occasion Eliot traveled all the way across the United States by train to see Emily Hale in California, where she'd been teaching acting at Scripps College, that door apparently remained closed. The poet refraining from adultery, but maintaining a correspondence with Miss Hale for the next 20 years, letters that only became available to the public in 2019 on the same day as a letter from Eliot was posthumously released disavowing their relationship and proclaiming that he had burned all the letters he'd received from Emily. To an unquestionable degree, Eliot's letter served to demonstrate how he had abandoned Miss Hale after his wife had died, quickly replacing her with a new, unconsummated relationship, until suddenly ending it, along with his providing of help to John Chamberlain, when, at the age of 64, the writer married his 30-year-old secretary, Valerie Fletcher, perhaps achieving in that relationship the vision from the end of the four quartets, when the rose of romance became one with the Pentecostal flame of the Holy Spirit, before having been a lifelong heavy smoker, dying of emphysema some 8 years later in 1965. Within his plays in particular, Eliot seems to combine his literary concept of an objective correlative, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion that the poet feels and hopes to evoke in the reader, with some very deeply encoded issues derived from his personal life. In Sweeney agonistus, meaning an individual engaged in a struggle, and an apparent allusion to the blind John Milton's Eyeless in Gaza epic poem Samson agonistus, the central character observes any man has to, needs to, once in a lifetime do a girl in. With the family reunion, man is haunted by guilt and the ancient furies because he'd been thinking of killing his wife at a time she'd fallen to her death from a passenger ship. And in the cocktail party, drafted just after ending things with Emily Hale, following breaking off a relationship to return to his estranged wife, a man's abandoned love interest is persuaded to become a missionary who is subsequently crucified on an anthill by the indigenous people she'd sought to convert to Christianity, becoming a martyr in a death which was then described by the mysterious get past oneself psychological counselor who sent her on a mission in the first place as being triumphant. Then, in 1957, after having married, while also considering starting to take dancing lessons, T.S. Eliot struck up a correspondence and friendship with one-time vaudevillian, comedic film star, and You Bet Your Life television game show host, Groucho Marx. Still, what Eliot created and left behind him for posterity was an encapsulation of attitudes regarding the perceived emptiness of modernity and an attempt to somehow find a way to fill it, showing the world both fear and a handful of dust, and creating the basis for Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical interpretation of Old Possum's book of Practical Cats, while also producing the unforgettable phrases and tributes to memory, whether or not Alone in the Moonlight, as "In my beginning is in my end, and we shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." I'm Jeff Helgeson. Heirloom Books is located at 6239 North Clark Street in Chicago, Illinois.